On the morning of November 12, 2007, in Lafayette County, Arkansas, a hunter named Ray E. Ulmer, age 44, prepared for a long day of deer hunting. Like many others during deer season, he traveled before sunrise to a leased property in the Walker Creek area, an expanse of land used by hunters looking for whitetail. He arrived early in the day while it was still dark, and made his way into the woods. Reports later placed him in position by around 6 o'clock a.m. Ray was using a tree stand, an elevated platform secured to a tree, which allows hunters to sit above the ground for better visibility and a reduced chance of being detected by deer. These stands are extremely popular, but they carry a risk. Climbing into them often requires balance, grip strength, and careful movement. And many hunters each year experience accidents while entering, exiting, or sitting in them. But either way, Ray entered his stand and settled in for the morning hunt. Deer are most active around dawn, and hunters may sit quietly for hours waiting for an animal to appear. Ray was alone in his section of the lease, which was not unusual, as hunting leases are large and participants often spread out to avoid disturbing each other's areas. But at some point in the morning, an accident occurred. While positioned in the stand, Ray lost his balance and fell backward. Instead of falling on the ground, which would have caused serious injuries by itself, his feet became tangled in the stand structure as he slipped. The result was that his body dropped below the stand, leaving him hanging upside down. This was not a brief entanglement. Once his feet and boots were wedged, Ray was unable to free himself. His body weight worked against him, pulling him downward while his legs remained trapped above. He was left completely inverted, suspended head down, with no way to free himself. The hours stretched on. While hunters nearby were focused on their own stands and blinds, Ray remained stuck. He had started his day at 6 a.m., but it wasn't until about 2:30 p.m. the others in the lease finally came across him, and by then he had been upside down for most of the day. When the fellow hunters found him, the situation was grim. Authorities were immediately called, and the Lafayette County Sheriff's Office responded to the scene. After assessing what happened, investigators confirmed that there was no signs of foul play and no involvement of any other person. It was an accident caused by the fall and the entanglement in the stand. The official cause was explained as the result of being inverted for a prolonged period of time. This is consistent with what is known medically as suspension trauma, also called suspension syndrome. It is a condition that occurs when someone is left hanging in a fixed position, often in a harness or rope system, or in this case, with their body inverted. The psychology of suspension trauma is devastating. In a normal upright position, the muscles of the legs help pump blood back toward the heart, but when someone is hanging upside down and immobilized, circulation breaks down. Blood is forced by gravity into the head and the upper body, and without the ability to move or adjust, it cannot return efficiently. As minutes pass, the face begins to swell and darken, sometimes with tiny hemorrhages. The tongue and lips can enlarge as venous blood pools in the tissues. Pressure inside the skull rises steadily, leading to severe pain and eventually unconsciousness. As the condition progresses, the lungs begin to fill with fluid in a process called pulmonary edema. Victims can produce a frothy discharge from their mouth and nose, and breathing becomes increasingly labored. The chest muscles and diaphragm struggle to expand against the pulling pressure. Meanwhile, the brain itself swells, while the legs may look pale because blood is no longer circulating effectively there. If left for long enough, the cardiovascular system collapses entirely. The heart cannot pump properly when circulation is reversed and restricted. Ultimately, vital organs stop functioning. Now, these graphic medical details that I just told you are not speculation. They are drawn from forensic studies of damn near identical cases where people were left inverted or suspended. Autopsy reports from other suspension trauma incidents consistently described marked swelling on the face, bulging eyes, heavy lungs filled with fluid, with widespread hemorrhages in the skin and eyes. Ray Ulmer was trapped in this condition for hours, which made the outcome unavoidable by the time he was discovered. Unfortunately, Ray would die. For the hunters who found him, the discovery was shocking. They had gone into the woods expecting to see a deer or a fellow sportsman, not a man hanging upside down, lifeless in his stand. They notified authorities, who secured the area and arranged for the recovery of the body. News of the tragedy spread quickly. The Associated Press reported on it, identifying Ray E. Omer by name, age, and hometown. And a funeral would be held in his honor 2 weeks after this. In the spring of 2012 in Nottington Hill, London, a 32-year-old man was inside his flat on the upper floors of a residential townhouse. Like many of the properties in the area, the building was part of a long row of Victorian-era homes, 3 and 4 stories high with tall sash windows that opened outward directly over the street. These windows had been designed more than a century earlier, in an age before modern safety regulations, and they lacked guardrails or child-proof barriers. For residents, they provided a fresh air and a view of the neighborhood, but they also carried risks because leaning out left only a narrow sill between a person and the drop to the ground. At street level, the property was lined with the kind of iron railings that are common across central London. These railings were originally installed in the 19th century, both as a decoration and as security. They consisted of vertical iron rods, each tipped with sharp points. The design served a practical purpose, deterring trespassers from climbing over, but they also became part of London's architectural landscape. To passerbyers, they appeared ordinary, almost invisible through familiarity. From above, however, they represented something far more dangerous, a set of steel spikes pointing upward, waiting beneath every open window. On that day in 2012, the man was near one of his flat's windows when he dropped something small. According to reports at the time, it was most likely his keys. For most people, this would mean walking down the stairs and retrieving them. But instead, he leaned out the 3rd floor window to try and reach what he had lost. From that height, more than 30 feet above the pavement, there was nothing to steady him, no balcony or no barrier. In the act of stretching too far, he lost his balance. Once gravity took over, there was no way to recover. He fell forward out of the window and down toward the street below. What lay directly beneath him were the iron spikes of the railing. When his body struck the railing, the outcome was devastating. The iron points pierced his torso, driven in by the full force of the fall. The weight of his body forced them deeper, and he was left hanging above the pavement, impaled. Witnesses described the scene as horrifying, a man suspended on the railings, unmoving, and his body skewered by multiple spikes. Emergency services were called immediately, and London accidents of this kind trigger a multi-agency response. Paramedics, police officers, and firefighters arrived within minutes. Paramedics rushed to assess whether he was still alive, while police cordoned off the area to control crowds. Firefighters stood ready with any specialized equipment. In impalement cases like this, if there is any chance of survival, the standard procedure is to leave the object in place. Attempting to pull a person off spikes unseen causes even greater bleeding because the spikes may be sealing major blood vessels. Firefighters are often tasked with cutting through sections of the railings so the victim can be transported to a hospital still attached, where surgeons can remove the object under controlled conditions. But in this case, the injuries were so severe, there was no possibility of recovery. By the time first responders reached him, the damage was unsurvivable. He would unfortunately die on the scene. Now, the death was quickly determined to be a tragic accident. Investigators found no foul play and no evidence of deliberate self-harm. The man had dropped his keys, attempted to retrieve them by leaning out, and in doing so lost balance and fell. It was a simple sequence of everyday actions that ended in one of the most worst ways imaginable. Accidents like this are rare, but they are not unique. Every year in large cities, people fall from windows or balconies while leaning out, cleaning or retrieving objects. In London, the danger is multiplied by the presence of those historic railings. Unlike a flat pavement, which may cause blunt trauma, but can occasionally be survivable depending on the height, spikes concentrate all the force of a fall into narrow points. They puncture vital organs, tear through arteries, and transform a fall into an impalement. In rare cases, there have been survivors of similar accidents, but only when the spikes missed major arteries or the heart, and when rapid surgical intervention was possible. And even then, recovery is long and filled with complications such as infection, nerve damage, and chronic pain. For most victims, the injuries are immediate and fatal. In early 2024, traffic on the 118 freeway in Los Angeles was moving as it does on any weekday morning. Cars crowded the lanes, commuters rushed to work, and large trucks hauled supplies across the San Fernando Valley. Among the many commercial vehicles that day was a flatbed truck carrying a heavy load of lumber. Log planks were stacked together, stretching nearly the full length of the trailer. Regulations required that kind of cargo to be secured tightly with chains or ratchet straps. But with heavy loads, even one strap failing can mean a disaster. For drivers behind the flatbed, the sight of boards or pipes can be unsettling. Many keep extra distance, aware of the risk if something breaks loose. On this morning, a box truck followed the flatbed as both vehicles made their way along the freeway. Behind the wheel was a 23-year-old driver heading through Chatsworth, a neighborhood on the northwestern edge of Los Angeles. As the vehicle rode along, something shifted in the lumber stack. Whether it was a sudden break, uneven pavement, or a load not properly fastened, one plank would break free. In a split second, it slid backwards off the bed of the truck. Instead of falling flat on the road, the board dropped at an angle, its weight and momentum turning it into a spear. The plank spun through the air for only a moment before it struck. It hit the windshield of the box truck directly behind, and the impact was explosive. Safety glass designed to resist blunt force trauma shattered instantly, sending fragments across the cab. But the lumber did not stop at the glass. The heavy length of the wood tore through the windshield and kept going, penetrating deep into the interior. The driver had no chance to react. The plank drove straight into the driver's side, impaling him in his seat. The sheer velocity of the strike forced the lumber through his torso, anchoring him against the seat back. Witnesses would later describe the scene as nightmarish. The board protruded through the front of the windshield and extended out the back of the cab, as though the entire vehicle had been skewered. Other motorists slammed on their brakes. Traffic screeched to a halt around the crash site. Shocked witnesses dialed 911, their voices frantic as they described what they had just seen. Within minutes, police units, firefighters, and paramedics were racing toward the scene. Firefighters brought cutting equipment, prepared to saw through lumber or metal if necessary to free the victim. But the injuries inside the cab, like the story before, were catastrophic. The lumber had pierced straight through the driver's upper body. A plank of that size carries immense kinetic energy at a freeway speed. It was later determined that such a strike would likely have punctured the lungs, torn major vessels like the aorta, and possibly even ruptured the heart. The combination of injuries would have caused massive blood loss and immediate cardiac collapse. By the time paramedics would reach him, it was clear that nothing was to be done. He had been killed instantly at the moment of impact. First responders described it as one of the most grisliest scenes they had ever witnessed. The plank of lumber had turned the vehicle into a giant stake, with the driver locked in place, lifeless. As investigations worked the scene, they pieced together the chain of events. A load of lumber had not been adequately secured. One plank had slipped off the truck and the vehicle behind and had been in the worst possible place at the worst possible time. Police closed multiple lanes of the 118 freeway for hours as they photographed the site, measured skid marks, and collected witness statements. Now, the brutality of the crash was undeniable. The plank had pierced with such a force that parts of the cab itself were split open. Blood covered the interior, the windshield frame was bent outward around the path of the wood. For the firefighters who had to cut the lumber to eventually remove the victim and transport him to the coroner, in the days that followed this, the man's name was released to the public. Manny Camacho, 23 years old. He had been driving that morning like countless others, unaware that a single unsecured plank would end his life. His family described him as a young man with his whole future ahead of him. His mother explained that it was a blunt force trauma to the torso that had killed him instantly. To the family, it felt unreal. a freak accident, violent and senseless. A memorial fund was launched to help cover funeral expenses and to support his loved ones in the aftermath. Donations would pour in, and families, co-workers and strangers alike contributed, moved by the sheer randomness of the tragedy. Though the funeral itself was held private, the outpouring of support demonstrated how deeply the story resonated with those who read about it.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.
Hunts Point Avenue that looked ordinary from the outside. Inside, however, the apartments weren't ordinary homes. They were part of New York City's cluster site program. These were private apartments rented by the city to house homeless families, a program long criticized for poor conditions, neglectful landlords, and safety hazards that tenants often said went unaddressed. The Ambrose family had been placed there. Danielle and Peter were raising their 2 daughters. One was barely 1 year old and the other just 2. Their apartment was on the first floor, and like many older Bronx apartments, it was heated by a steam radiator, a technology that, while common, carries risks if not properly maintained. Now, radiators are connected to high-pressure steam pipes that run throughout the building, and that can reach temperatures above 200 degrees. Any failure of valves or caps can turn them from sources of warmth into dangerous machines. On the afternoon of December 7th, 2016, the Ambrose sisters were in their bedroom, a small first-floor space, barely enough for 2 children's beds and a radiator pressed against the wall. Their parents believed they were safe, napping in the familiar warmth that the old cast iron radiator provided. So a few hours go by and the parents were doing their normal activities around the house, until they heard a loud and violent pop. Then they would feel like if the room they were in was getting hotter by the second, but almost immediately after they would hear something horrifying. They heard screams, and not just any screams, it was their kids. So like any parent, when they hear their kids scream, they would run to their kid's bedroom. But they would notice something odd. The closer they got to the bedroom, the hotter it would get. So as they finally got to the bedroom door, they could see steam coming from underneath the door creeping out. By now, the kids had stopped screaming. It was replaced by the sound of something screeching. When they opened the door, they were blasted by the heated steam. But when they got in, it was like stepping into another world. The room they once knew, the place with their daughter's small beds, scattered toys, and colorful blankets, was unrecognizable. It had transformed into a suffocating white chamber, thick steam pressed against their skin and lungs, making it nearly impossible to breathe. The windows were fog solid, water beating and running down the panes, dripping into the floorboards with a steady patter. The old radiator roared like a broken engine, its valve gone, releasing a continuous jet of vapor that filled the air with a piercing hiss. Every surface was slick with condensation, the walls sweating, the blankets soaked through in seconds. The air itself felt alive, clawing, searing, and heavy, and in the middle of all of it were the 2 girls. Their tiny frames were barely visible through the dense fog, outlines blurred by the swirling mist. The parents tried to push forward, but the heat struck them like a wall, forcing them to shield their faces with their arms. Their instincts told them to grab their children, but every step towards those beds meant entering a cloud hot enough to burn through clothing. They just couldn't get to them, but by now one of the neighbors had heard the loud pop and the kids screaming and had called emergency services. One of the other neighbors had pulled the fire alarm, as even though the valve that popped was in the Ambrose's apartment, they could still feel the heat creeping into the hallway. Steam was rolling out from under the Ambrose's door, curling upward into the corridor lights, and the normally still air of the building now felt damp and stifling. Neighbors gathered in confusion and fear, some shouting down the stairwell for help, others pounding on doors to make sure everyone was awake and aware. Inside, Danielle and Peter were still fighting against the impossible heat. Each time they tried to push deeper into the room, the scorching vapor forced them back, burning their skin and filling their lungs with air so hot it was like breathing fire. They shouted their daughters' names over and over, their voices hoarse, praying the girls would answer. but the only sound left was the relentless hiss of the radiator screeching like a broken whistle as it continued to pump steam into the bedroom. Within minutes, the hallway was filled with shouts and blare of alarms. The fire department arrived quickly, sirens echoing off the brick buildings of the Hunts Point Avenue. Firefighters rushed inside, masks on, turnout gear, shielding them from the heat that ordinary clothes could not withstand. They forced their way through the cloud, visibility near zero, feeling their way forward until they reached the children's beds. When they emerged, the scene was silent, but for the hiss of the broken radiator and the wails of the parents in the hallway. The firefighters carried the two girls out in the cold December air and straight into waiting ambulances. Danielle and Peter followed, staggering, soaked, and red from the heat, desperate for a miracle. At the Lincoln Hospital, doctors did everything they could, but the damage was already irreversible. The official report later listed the cause of death as thermal burns and injuries from exposure to hot steam, a manner accidental. When the radiator valve blew in the Ambrose sisters' room, the release of steam was instant and catastrophic. Unlike dry heat, steam carries enormous amounts of energy and it transfers it directly into skin and airways. At over 200 degrees Fahrenheit, it causes severe burns in less than a second, and because it surrounds the body, there is no escape from contact. The two girls were asleep just feet from the radiator. The violent burst woke them, and neighbors recalled hearing their screams, the first reaction to sudden searing pain and the suffocating heat that filled the room. Inhaling that vapor would have burned their mouths, throats, and lungs almost immediately, making it difficult to cry out for long. Each breath scalded the airway further, swelling it shut, while their skin blistered in the dense fog. Within moments, the small bedroom had become a sealed chamber of heat. The girls' bodies overheated rapidly, their core temperatures spiking in a condition the medical examiner later described as horrible. Their screams stopped quickly, not because the danger lessened, but because they were already being overwhelmed. By the time firefighters forced their way in, both sisters were unresponsive, with their injuries just being too severe to survive. The malfunction came down to a single critical weak point in the radiator: the valve assembly. On old steam systems, that valve regulates how much vapor enters the cast iron radiator and also serves as a release point for pressure. It's basically a safety component, and when it fails, all the force of the building steam lines has only one place to go. In the Ambrose's apartment, the valve didn't just leak, it blew off entirely. Investigators and witnesses said it was as if the cap had been shot across the room. That left an open hole directly connected to the high-pressure steam main. In a matter of seconds, the small bedroom was flooded with vapor at more than 200 degrees Fahrenheit, like I said before. Why it failed was tied to age and poor maintenance. Many of the cluster site apartments had outdated heating systems, often decades old, with corroded parts and patchwork fixes. Tenants had complained about heat and radiator issues in the building before, but those concerns hadn't been addressed. In fact, the landlord, Mosh Piler, had a long history of violations, and when the parents learned of this, they sued. Not only for their daughters, but also for the pain they had suffered, because they also got quite injured. Nowhere near the same level as their daughters, but pretty bad. So in December 2017, 1 year after the incident, the parents filed a lawsuit against the city of New York. Their attorneys argued that the city knowingly placed the family in an apartment that wasn't safe, managed by a landlord with a long record of violations. Court filings highlighted that the building's owner, Mosh Piler, had been repeatedly cited for failing to make repairs and was even on the city's worst landlord lists. The lawsuit sought damages for negligence, pointing to the city's failure to inspect and maintain the apartment before assigning it to a vulnerable family. While the case worked its way through the courts, the tragedy fueled public outrage. Under mounting pressure, New York City finally announced in 2021 that it would end the cluster site program entirely, a direct response in part to the deaths of the two girls. Also, it seems that the family won but never disclosed how much money they had received. Mostly every suburban neighborhood in the US has trees in them. They all range from different sizes, some may be quite small, but some may be large. But having these trees in these neighborhoods brings challenges. One of the biggest is storm damages. Like we all know, when a tree gets too large, it grows out large branches and many of them. And since these trees are very close to homes, when a storm hits, there's a chance that one of these branches will break off and fall on one of these houses. And obviously this is bad, so landowners will hire private contractors to cut and trim these trees. And that's what happened in the northern suburbs of Salt Lake City and Kaysville. These were quiet neighborhoods with tall cottonwoods and maple trees that have stood for decades. And since they have stood for decades, every now and then they needed to be trimmed. So one of the landlords was worried that the tree on his property was getting a bit too big. So they called a tree cutting company, and this company would send out Santos Badulio Lopez Perez and one other person. Now, Santos was quite experienced in this kind of work. With him being 49 years old, he was trusted to be the one that would climb the tree and trim it, while the other guy was at the bottom tasked with cleaning up, so taking the branches and putting it in their trailer. So on the morning of March 19th, 2025, Santos arrived for a routine job on Shadowbrook Lane in Kaysville. It was a sort of neighborhood where children played on bicycles and residents kept their lawns neat, but the trees loomed large above it all. One of those trees needed topping, a process where the upper section is removed to make way for safe felling or trimming. It is one of the most technical and hazardous parts of tree care. Santos climbed about 30 feet up, secured by his harness and ropes, and started to trim the tree, and everything was going fine. He honestly made it look easy, but tree work has a cruel truth. The margin for error is razor thin, and even when the cut is correct, the tree itself can behave unpredictably. Wood under pressure doesn't always break the way a clipper expects, and when something goes wrong, there's often no time to react. Now, as Santos made his final cut to free the top section, the wood shifted in an instant. Instead of tipping away as intended, the heavy top swung back. In a sudden, violent motion, it struck him before he had time to move clear. The force of the blow was instant and devastating. One moment, Santos was cutting with steady precision, the next he was struck hard enough to snap his head back and knock him limp. His chainsaw went silent as it swung from his lanyard, and his whole body slumped in the harness that just seconds earlier had kept him secure. Now, it left him dangling in a way that made the situation feel even more dire. Suspended mid-air, motionless, his arms hanging, his helmet tilted awkwardly against the trunk he had been working on. Now, when this happened, the worker on the bottom saw this. He grabbed his phone and called 911 fast. He told them the situation. He then started to yell at Santos to see if he was still alive. Obviously, he didn't respond. Unfortunately, the worker didn't have no climbing gear, so he couldn't climb all the way to the top of the tree to try to help. He could only really just wait for emergency services to arrive. And in a few minutes after that, the Kaysville police and fire arrived quickly, joined by paramedics. The scene presented a grim challenge. Santos was still dangling in his harness, 30 feet off the ground. Reaching him meant deploying a rope rescue system, something firefighters train for but rarely have to use in real life. Crews worked quickly, rigging pulleys and lines, climbing to secure him and carefully lowering his body to the ground. When they reached him, it was clear that the injuries were too severe. Santos was unresponsive, but paramedics began CPR immediately, their voices sharp with urgency as they worked in the middle of a gathering crowd. For nearly 10 minutes, they cycled compressions and breaths, fighting to keep him alive long enough to get him to a hospital. An air ambulance was dispatched. Soon, Santos was loaded aboard and flown to the University of Utah Medical Center in Salt Lake City, the state's top trauma hospital. His family was notified. Hours later, despite the best efforts of rescuers and doctors, the news was confirmed. Santos had died from his injuries. The official reports about Santos don't give a detailed medical breakdown of his injuries, as news outlets generally avoid publishing graphic forensic details, but we can piece together a clear picture of what likely happened based on how he was struck. The falling top of the tree swung back and hit him while he was still tied. Being struck by a heavy tree section can cause massive blunt force trauma, broken bones, head injury, or internal bleeding. Why he went limp immediately, witnesses and rescuers described him as unconscious, hanging in his harness. That suggests he either suffered a serious head impact, concussion, or skull fracture, or such severe chest or abdominal trauma that he lost consciousness right away. Why CPR was needed. Paramedics started CPR as soon as he was lowered, meaning his heart had either stopped or was barely beating. This points to injuries that disrupted vital organs, possibly a crushed chest, massive internal bleeding, or traumatic brain injury. So in plain terms, he'd likely had a catastrophic head, chest, or upper body impact, clearly loss of consciousness, internal bleeding, and organ trauma, which is absolutely devastating. A GoFundMe page to help support his wife and children was launched, sharing memories of Santos as a kind, hardworking man who lived for his family. Messages poured in from strangers moved by the story, each one acknowledging the unfairness of a life cut so short. In every big city, there are people who chase thrills where others only see routine. For some, that means climbing bridges or sneaking into abandoned buildings. For others, it means testing themselves against the machines that keep the city alive. In New York, one of the most dangerous stunts of all is train surfing, climbing onto the outside of a moving train and riding it as it races through the night. Most people only see trains from the inside, rows of seats, fluorescent lights, the rocking sway of steel on steel. But from the outside, those trains are massive and unforgiving machines. Their surfaces are slick with grime, their roofs pressed dangerously close to tunnels and overhead wires. It is a gamble with death. Yet, on a summer night in 2018, a 24-year-old man named Michael Vigilant decided to take that gamble. He traveled from his hometown of Hudson, New Hampshire to New York City, and found himself near Yankee Stadium in the Bronx. Crowds poured into the streets after a game, commuters flooded the platforms, and above all, the trains kept rolling. But Michael wasn't interested in riding inside. Along with at least one companion, he climbed onto the top of a Metro North train as it began its journey north. To really understand the danger he faced, you need to know how these trains work. Unlike buses or cars which run on fuel, many New York commuter trains are powered by electricity. And that electricity doesn't come from a battery. Instead, it comes from catenary wires, thick lines suspended above the tracks. These wires carry enormous voltage, between 12,000 and 25,000 volts. For comparison, the outlet in your living room wall carries about 120 volts. A shock from that can injure or even kill under the wrong conditions. And the overhead wires above trains carry 100 to 200 times that amount. So a single touch is more than enough to end a life. But Michael may have not fully understood this. On the roof, the experience would have felt wild and cinematic. The Bronx skyline rushing past, the wind whipping at his clothes, and the whole city spread out beneath him. Inside, passengers had no idea someone was balancing on the roof above their heads. Then, as the train picked up speed, Michael moved too close to the wires overhead. What happened next was as sudden as it was horrific. The instant his body touched the catenary wire, a torrent of electricity surged into him. Witnesses inside the train later described seeing a flash of light, like a bolt of lightning erupting overhead, followed by a loud crackling snap. For those looking upward, it was as if a human being had collided with raw lightning. The current didn't just jolt him, it consumed him. His muscles seized so violently that his entire body locked stiff. His spine arced backward, his jaw clamped shut, with his hands curled into claws he couldn't release. This is what high voltage does. It overrides the brain, forcing every muscle into a spasm at once. Where the electricity entered his body, it blasted deep, blackened wounds called entry burns. The flesh there wasn't just singed, it was cooked by the heat of the current. Inside, the electricity carved its path through blood vessels, nerves, and vital organs. That path of destruction left catastrophic damage. Tissue burned, vessels ruptured, and signals scrambled. His heart's rhythm collapsed, instantly thrown into deadly fibrillation. At the same time, the electrical assault froze the muscles of his chest, paralyzing his ability to breathe. The current needed an exit point, and it found one through his feet, pressed against the metal roof. There, the burns were even worse. Charred patches where flesh, muscle, and even bone had been torn apart by the heat. Smoke rose from his body, with the smell of scorched clothing and burned skin spread across the train. If Michael remained conscious for even a fraction of a second, the pain would have been unimaginable. Survivors of lesser shocks describe the feeling as being set on fire from the inside, with every nerve igniting at once. But in this case, the current was too strong and too overwhelming. Within moments, his body collapsed. Passengers below felt the train jolt as the conductor hit the emergency brake. Word spread quickly. Someone was on the roof. For some riders who dared to look, saw the aftermath. The figure of a man crumpled against the steel, with smoke still curling into the night air. When emergency crews reached him, the damage told the story plainly. His clothes were scorched, the fabric burned away in places. His skin was blistered, blackened, and split at the points where the current had entered and exited. His body was still, no pulse and no breath. The electricity had destroyed him in less than a second, and he was pronounced dead at the scene. Back in Hudson, New Hampshire, his community was stunned. For most, the very idea of climbing on a moving train seemed foreign, something they had only seen in movies or YouTube clips. Few had ever heard the term train surfing, yet there was a young man they knew killed in one of the most brutal ways imaginable, hundreds of miles away in New York. Experts explained what happened in plain terms. High voltage electricity doesn't merely pass through you, it obliterates. Blood can heat so quickly that it clots instantly. Muscles contract with such a force, they tear themselves apart. Nerves are destroyed, leaving the brain unable to send or receive signals, with the heart and lungs shutting down not gently but violently, as their natural rhythms are replaced with chaos. Survivors of this are almost unheard of, and those who do live often wake up without limbs, with horrific scars, or with lifelong disabilities. For much of his adult life, Larry Hedrick lived with disabilities that left him unable to care for himself. By the time he reached 61, his condition meant he could no longer bathe, feed, or even fully communicate without the help of others. Every part of his routine depended on caregivers. Nurses and aides managed his meals, monitored his health, and guided him through the most basic parts of daily life. His vulnerability was constant, and it was this dependence that placed him in a long-term state facility called Hopemont Hospital, located in Terra Alta, West Virginia. The building housed nearly 100 residents, many of them elderly or severely disabled people who needed structure and around-the-clock care. Life inside moved by schedule. Meals at the same hours, medications on rotation, baths and hygiene set by staff availability. Now, on January 4th, 2024, his day was going quite normal for him. Throughout the day he did his normal routines, but by the afternoon it was time for his bath. And as he was disabled, he needed help getting to the designated bathroom, so the staff got him there. Now, this facility had mechanical chairs to move patients safely in and out of the tubs, and staff were expected to test water temperatures carefully and monitor residents closely and ensure that every bath was conducted within strict safety limits. On paper, it was a procedure designed to protect people exactly like Hedrick. So he was transferred into the bathing system that afternoon. One caregiver was assigned to help him with the bath, Kayla Beard. So she had the tub filled with water and had the chair lower him in, and what should have been a short supervised routine began. But the safeguards that existed to prevent danger were not followed. The water in the tub had reached approximately 134 degrees Fahrenheit, far above safe bathing limits. At such a temperature, burns can occur in seconds. To put that in perspective, water at 120 degrees can scald within 5 minutes. At 130, serious burns form in under a minute. At 134, deep burns happen almost immediately. Hedrick, being disabled, was unable to move or call for help. He was left immersed for 47 minutes. Now I bet you are wondering, what about the caregiver? Well, after lowering him in, she walked away without checking the temperature of the water. In nursing homes, baths are supposed to be short and supervised, usually between 10 to 20 minutes, and often less if the resident can't communicate. Leaving someone unattended for nearly an hour is far outside normal practice, and that's what she did. Nearly an hour passed without any intervention, and when she finally returned to the room, the injuries he had sustained were catastrophic. His skin had suffered severe second and third degree burns, with large portions of his body blistered, charred, or peeling. Some areas were so burned and so deep that nerve endings were destroyed, leaving skin waxy or blackened, and others blistering had ruptured, exposing raw tissue beneath. The damage covered enough of his body that doctors would later describe it as life-threatening from the moment it had occurred. She pulled him from the tub and notified Delilah Clyburn Hill, as she was a registered nurse. At that point, she had a duty to treat the injuries properly, but apparently she didn't. Now, we don't know what she was doing, whether she was charting, checking on other residents, or just flat out ignoring the situation outright, but whatever she was doing, it wasn't what she was supposed to. And we know this because there was no effort from her trying to treat Hedrick, so no cooling of the burns, no dressings, no pain meds, and the most bizarre thing of all, no one immediately called 911. So Hedrick was sitting on the metal chair out of the tub, suffering because she wasn't even trying to treat him. He was just sitting there, suffering. Now, it's not stated anywhere for how long, but eventually someone finally called 911. By the time paramedics finally arrived, Larry was still in agony. His skin was burned so severely that the large areas had already begun weeping fluid, soaking through whatever thin coverings the staff had draped over him. The smell of scorched flesh filled the room, and every moment sent shockwaves of pain through his body. When EMS got him into a stretcher, they could see the extent of his injuries immediately. Second and third degree burns stretching across his lower half, wounds so deep that recovery would be nearly impossible without specialized care. He was rushed out of Hopemont and transferred to the West Penn Burn Center in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There, doctors and burn specialists began aggressive treatment. Intravenous fluids were pumped into him to fight the massive losses pouring out through his damaged skin. Strong narcotics were administered to try to dull the relentless pain, though even heavy sedation only blunted it. Nurses covered his body with sterile dressings, but those had to be changed again and again, each time ripping away more tissue and reigniting the torment. For a week, Larry lived like this. Every hour brought a new battle. His body was in hypermetabolic overdrive, burning calories at a furious pace in a desperate attempt to heal. His immune system was compromised, leaving him at risk of sepsis. His vital signs swung wildly as doctors struggled to stabilize him. Family members sat watching helplessly as he groaned and twitched in pain, wrapped in bandages, tubes running in and out, and machines tracking a body that was failing. The visible injuries were horrifying. In some places, his skin was bright red, raw, and blistering. In others, it was pale and waxy, evidence of third-degree destruction. Where blistering had ruptured, there was nothing but exposed tissue, a wounded surface that stretched across much of his lower body. These were injuries doctors compared to fire victims, and they all came not from an explosion, not from an industrial accident, but something as ordinary as a bath. On January 12, 2024, 8 days after the scalding, Larry Hedrick died. His body simply could not withstand the trauma. The death certificate tied directly to the burns he had sustained in that tub at Hopemont. Afterward, investigators began piecing together what had exactly gone wrong. What they found was damning. Staff had reported hot water problems weeks earlier. The thermostat was malfunctioning, allowing water to reach dangerously high temperatures. But nothing was fixed. Kyla Beard, the CNA, failed to check the water and walked away after lowering him in. Delilah Clyburn Hill, the RN, failed to act when told about the injuries. And those two failings, one of action and one of inaction, a man was left to suffer and die. Both women were later charged with felony neglect of an incapacitated adult, resulting in death. Prosecutors say Beard caused the burns by leaving him in scalding water for 47 minutes. Clyburn Hill, they alleged, worsened his suffering by failing to provide even the most basic emergency care after the injuries were discovered. The evening at Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport followed its familiar routine. Flights rode in one after another, lights blinking across the apron as ground crews positioned chalks, cones, and equipment. The soundscape was the same mix it always was. Engines winding down, the rumble of tugs towing carts, backup alarms beeping, radio squawking with instructions. At around 10:30 p.m. on August 30th, 2022, a Frontier Airlines jet had just parked, and the ramp workers employed by GAT Airline Ground Support were in place to unload it. Their job was one most travelers never think about, making sure luggage comes off the aircraft swiftly and gets onto carts for the short ride to the terminal. Now, one of these employees assigned to this task was 26-year-old Germani Thompson. She was a basketball player in her college years and alumna of Riverside Academy in East St. John High School in Louisiana, and later played at Heston College in Kansas and Tougaloo College in Mississippi, where she earned a degree in sociology. Friends and family said she was vibrant, athletic, and ambitious. That night, she was on the ramp wearing her safety vest, part of a crew that had done this hundreds of times before. The key piece of equipment in use was the belt loader. It looks like a truck with a conveyor running alongside its frame, tilted up to reach the aircraft's cargo bin. Luggage is placed onto it at one end and comes out at the other, where workers grab each bag and stack it on metal carts. The machine is simple but full of hidden dangers. The rollers that drive the belt create tight gaps, nip points, that will catch and pull in anything that crosses them. Training emphasizes this. Tie back long hair, remove jewelry, and avoid loose clothing. Germani was stationed at ground level, receiving the bags as they came down the conveyor. She repeated the motion dozens of times. Reach, lift, pivot, and set the suitcase into the carts. The belt kept running, feeding more luggage into her hands. The floodlights cast sharp shadows and the noise of apron made communication difficult, and every worker focused on their specific task. The pace was steady and the work physical but routine. Then, in an instant, something ordinary became catastrophic. Germani leaned toward the belt to grab another bag. Strands of her hair fell close enough to the edge of the conveyor that the roller seized them, and the belt did not tug gently. It clamped and wound with mechanical strength, pulling her head toward the machine. And this force was irresistible. Before she could react, her hair was entangled, and the momentum of the belt dragged her face and neck directly into the rollers. The violence of that moment is difficult to overstate. The belt yanked her head forward with enough torque to fracture her cervical vertebrae. Witnesses described her body snapping toward the machine and collapsing. A scalp entanglement at that speed can rip skin from the skull, tear muscle, and twist the neck until bones give away. In Germani's case, the medical description was blunt: a broken neck. For the co-workers who saw it happen, the image was seared into their memory. Hair trapped in steel rollers, body crumpled against the loader, and the sudden transition from routine work to horror. Chaos erupted on the ramp. The emergency shutoff was hit and the conveyor went still, but the damage was already done. Workers rushed to free her, tugging at her hair, pulling her from the machine, and laying her on the ground beside it. The sounds of the airport continued around them, air units humming, carts rolling, while a small group of ramp workers screamed into radios for help and tried to figure out how to save their colleague. Paramedics were called immediately, but nothing could really be done. The injuries were just too catastrophic. A broken neck from such force compromises the body's ability to breathe, cuts off blood flow, and often leads to near-instant collapse. Even so, responders attempted everything possible. She was lifted onto a stretcher, rushed to an ambulance, and taken from the apron to the hospital. For those who remained, the image of her limp body leaving the scene was unbearable. Not long after, word spread that she had been pronounced dead. The physical reality of what she endured is harrowing. When hair is pulled into a conveyor, the scalp is stretched with tremendous force. The skin can tear from the skull and what is called scalping, leaving raw bone exposed. If the head is forced toward the roller, for the victim, the experience is sudden and overwhelming, painful and terrifying in the seconds before consciousness fades. Germani's death not only shocked her immediate team, but the wider aviation community. Ground handling is dangerous work, but fatalities like this are rare. Statements came quickly. The CEO of GAT expressed devastation and condolences, calling it a tragedy beyond comprehension. Her family was crushed, and her mother spoke publicly, describing the unbearable loss of a daughter who had been full of life and promise. The highway construction site in Bright, Michigan was like many others that summer. Cars rolled past in narrow lanes, orange cones marked the boundaries, and heavy equipment sat perched on disturbed soil. Workers in reflective vests moved in and out of view, managing a job that combined excavation, utility installation, and road work. The crew that day was working on a Michigan Department of Transportation project along Grand River Avenue near the I-96 interchange. They had been digging and setting up up structures below grade, the kind of infrastructure most people never see, but everyone depends on once the road is reopened. Among the men on site was 23-year-old Ryan Matthew Starnes of St. Clair Shores. He was not just another laborer, he was there with his family. His grandfather was the foreman overseeing the work, and his uncle was on the crew as well. Construction runs in families, and Ryan had been learning the trade directly from those who had done it for decades. He was young, strong, and carrying forward the work ethic passed down to him, part of a multi-generational team used to long days and hard labor. The centerpiece of their work that afternoon was an excavator positioned at grade. Its operator maneuvered the boom and bucket into a trench where utilities had been tied into a concrete structure. Ryan was in that trench, guiding and assisting near the fixed concrete while the bucket swung in to move soil and make space. Excavation is always a balancing act. The operator can see the big picture from the cab, but often blind spots at the edges of the cut. The man on the ground has the closest view, but is also in the danger zone if machine and concrete close the gap. Now, it was a little after 3 in the afternoon of June 30th, 2025. The machine's steel bucket swept down and into the space where Ryan was working. In an instant, its arc lined up with the concrete structure, and Ryan was caught between them. The bucket struck him and pinned him against the unyielding surface, and in less than a second, his body bore the full force of hydraulics designed to move tons of earth. There was no time to jump aside and no place for his body to go. The sound of the impact cut through the noise of the site. The operator froze the controls, crew members shouted and rushed in, but Ryan's body had taken the blow and the injuries were immediate and catastrophic. A steel bucket driving a human torso into concrete can shatter ribs like twigs. The rib cage that normally shields lungs and the heart is crushed inward, with bones puncturing tissue, and lungs can collapse, spilling air into the chest cavity where it suffocates from within. The spine compresses and fractures, and if the abdomen is caught, the liver or spleen can rupture, flooding the belly with blood. The pelvis can break apart, a ring of bone shattered by pressure it was never meant to absorb. Despite all of that, Ryan was still alive when they reached him. His body was broken, but his heart was still beating, and he was conscious enough to know what had happened to him. His uncle was there seeing the horror up close. His grandfather, the foreman, was the one who reached for him first, holding his grandson in his arms and the bottom of the trench. It was a scene of impossible contrasts. A young man crushed by a machine, and the man who had taught him the trade clutching him, trying to comfort him in the very moment the trade took him away. The crew called for help immediately. Radios barked with urgencies, supervisors shouted up to flag down emergency responders, and within minutes, Brighton police officers arrived, followed by Michigan State police troopers. EMS was dispatched, and they climbed into the cut and began trying to stabilize Ryan where he laid. His injuries were classified as critical from the start. He was secured onto a stretcher, lifted out of the trench with careful movements that must have caused him immense pain, and taken toward the waiting ambulance. His grandfather and uncle stood by, watching their family member being lifted away, the smell of diesel and dirt mixing with blood and sweat. Inside the ambulance, medics worked against the clock. They gave oxygen to compensate for crushed lungs, fluids to replace what was leaking eternally, and pain medication to blunt what could never truly be stopped. Ryan remained alive long enough to reach the hospital. He was rushed to the University of Michigan Hospital in Ann Arbor, a level 1 trauma center, where surgeons and doctors attempted to reverse the cascade of injuries. But crushing trauma of that scale overwhelms even the best medical care. Internal bleeding fills cavities faster than it can be drained. Organs that have been lacerated cannot be simply patched, they fail entirely. Muscles pressed under tons of force begin to die and release toxins that poison the body once circulation returns. Even if his bones could have been rebuilt, his lungs and heart had already been compromised beyond repair. What honestly makes his final minutes so horrific is the combination of pain, awareness, and helplessness. Unlike an instantaneous death, Ryan lived long enough to feel his body breaking down. Every attempt to breathe would have been like inhaling knives, ribs grinding against punctured lung tissue. Blood filling the chest cavity made each breath less effective, leaving him short of oxygen and his vision dimming at the edges. His abdomen may have been distended with internal bleeding, each moment sending shockwaves of agony. His heart would have raced, pounding in his chest, trying to compensate for blood loss. His skin would have grown clammy as circulation faltered. He likely looked up to his grandfather and uncle, understanding their faces, understanding his condition, and fearing what was happening to him. Now, of September 14th, 2025, the investigation is still going on, so we don't know if someone was criminally charged in connection with Ryan Matthew Starnes' death. All available reports described it as a workplace accident. The morning of November 8th, 2018 began like so many others in the dry hills of Northern California. For months, the land had been parched, mainly due to the long drought seasons, ringless summer sun, and a late autumn with no rain that had left the vegetation brittle and ready to ignite at the smallest spark. Across Butte County, residents of small mountain towns lived the uneasy balance between the beauty of forested ridges and the constant threat of wildfire. It was an old danger, but that morning it would erupt into something new, something no one had experienced before. That day, a firestorm now remembered simply as the Camp Fire tore through the Sierra Nevada footholds. It began in the early morning hours when electrical equipment belonging to Pacific and Electric sparked near the community of Puluga. Winds gusting at 40 to 50 miles per hour drove the flames westward at astonishing speed. By the time most people were just starting their day, walls of fire had already taken over canyons and crested ridges. Entire neighborhoods that had stood for decades would be reduced to ashes within hours. The town most often associated with the campfire is Paradise, a community of 26,000 people that was almost entirely destroyed. But before the fire reached Paradise, it tore through another settlement, smaller and less known but just as vulnerable. This was Concal, an unincorporated community nestled in the hills just a few miles east. Concal was home to scattered residents, mobile homes, and cabins. Many who lived there were older or retired, drawn to the affordable land and the quiet isolation. But that remoteness also meant there were fewer roads out, less infrastructure, and far less time to escape when the flames came. It was here in Concal that a 71-year-old man named Thomas T.K. Huff lived. Friends and family knew him as TK. He used a wheelchair because his mobility was limited by age and health. Like many in the foothills, he understood that wildfire was always a possibility, but knowing that danger is abstract until the moment it arrives. For Huff and others in Concal, the fire arrived with little warning, and it doesn't help when the campfire was not an ordinary wildfire. Investigators later calculated that it spread at an average rate of 80 acres per minute in its opening hours, which is way faster than any ordinary wildfire. In practical terms, that meant flames and smoke rolled over landscapes and even faster than emergency responders could issue warnings. In Concal, the firestorm descended so quickly that many residents had no time to gather belongings. Some fled barefoot, others wrapped in wet towels, still others abandoning vehicles when gridlock trapped them on narrow roads. And for a man in a wheelchair, the situation was even more dire. Huff could not simply just run. He could not climb into a car and muscle it through traffic. His survival depended on time, assistance, or both, things the campfire did not allow. So when the fire hit his house, he was caught quite off guard, still in his bedroom. The first signs would have not been the flames themselves, but the smoke. Thick, black, choking smoke would have poured into the room as the firestorm outside devoured trees, cars, and buildings in seconds. The power was already gone, leaving the house dim, lit only by the strange glow that grew brighter and brighter through the windows. The sound was deafening. Survivors compared it to a freight train mixed with the constant roar of a jet engine. Inside, the heat rose rapidly. Radiant heat from a wildfire of that size can push indoor temperatures past survivable levels even before flames breach the walls. Paint can bubble, plastics melt, and oxygen gets consumed, leaving the air unbreathable. For Huff, sitting in his chair, the reality would have struck all at once. He could not stay inside. That is when he made the decision that investigators later pieced together. He got out of his wheelchair. For a man with limited mobility, that alone was an act of sheer desperation. He lowered himself to the floor, the carpet already warm under his hands, and began to crawl. Crawling through that environment would have been agonizing. Every breath was poison. Smoke thick with burning plastic, wood, and metal scoured the throat and lungs. Inhaling once was enough to trigger violent coughing. Inhaling twice was enough to scorch the airway. His skin would have started to sting as radiant heat blasted through the walls. It was like standing too close to an open oven, except everywhere without escape. The closer he moved to the exit, the more intense it became. The fire outside moved with hurricane force. When it breached the home, through a window shattering from heat or flames racing through eaves, the interior would have transformed instantly. The oxygen inside the house would have been sucked into the inferno, causing a flashover. Temperatures soared past 1,000 degrees in seconds. For Huff, crawling on the ground and Mitt being hit by a blast of unbearable heat, his body blistering and his lungs searing with every breath. He would continue dragging himself for 10 more feet until he stopped near or close to the front door, where he met his end. Most likely by smoke inhalation, but possibly he could have succumbed to the extensive burns. We know how far he traveled because his wheelchair was found 10 feet away from where his body was. So he did try to escape, but given his circumstances and he also lived alone, there was really no hope for Thomas T.K. Huff. The campfire wildfire would go on to kill 87 more residents, including Thomas, and injure many, many more until it was finally contained. The ridges of Sherman County, Oregon stretched wide and open, fields of wheat cut by gravel roads and the occasional farmstead. Out here the sky feels bigger, the wind sharper, and the land more exposed. By 2007, this rural county was becoming part of a new experiment. Developers were racing to capture the region's relentless wind and turn it into power, erecting machines so large they would tower over everything else on the horizon. A modern wind turbine isn't a single piece of machinery, but a giant structure assembled in stages. Steel cylinders, each weighing many tons, are brought in on flatbed trucks. Crews use cranes to lift one section on top of the other, bolting them into place. Inside the tower, ladders and platforms allow workers to climb up, guiding pieces into position. When completed, the structure rises hundreds of feet, taller than most city skyscrapers, with a spinning set of blades that can cut through the air at airplane speeds. That August, crews in Sherman County were working on such tower. The job was routine in concept but never in practice. Steel had to align precisely, bolts had to be torqued correctly, cranes had to be moved smoothly despite gusts of wind that could sway an entire section as it dangled in the air. It was a job that combined engineering precision with raw physical danger. Among the men on site was 35-year-old Chad Mitchell. He was part of the construction crew that morning, one of the workers guiding the assembly of a tower slated to rise 242 feet into the air. Now, it was not a quiet environment. The diesel growl of machinery rumbled constantly, punctured by the clanging of metal tools and the shouted signals of men trying to coordinate movements. The tower itself, already standing tall and in complete form, loomed over the ridge. From the ground, it looked like progress, steel against sky, proof of the energy future. But for those who were working on it, a reminder of height, weight, and gravity. Chad was on the tower itself, high above the ground as work continued. From that vantage point, the view stretched across rolling farmland and the Columbia River Plateau, but there was little time to enjoy it. The job required focus, and every step on steel was a step over empty air. Every adjustment meant trusting the bolts, welds, and crane lines were exactly as they should be. But then, without the warning anyone expected, the structure began to fail. Now, a tower like this is meant to stand perfectly rigid, anchored on its base and strengthened with each new section. But something was wrong. A weakness in the assembly, whether a flaw in materials, a problem with the way it braced, or a misstep in procedure, began to give away. At first, it might have just been a groan of metal under strain, the kind of sound workers hear all the time. Then the groan became a shudder. The vertical cylinder was no longer holding firm, and then it started to collapse. Steel that had been pointing skyward bent and buckled, seams tearing apart under the enormous pressure. From the ground, men would have seen the impossible, the tower tilting, then folding in on itself like a drinking straw crushed in a fist. Tons of steel began to fall, and cranes could not hold it, no one could hold it. Now this wouldn't be too bad if Chad Mitchell was not still on it. The collapse turned his elevated position into a death trap. Instead of standing on a structure, he was suddenly riding it downward as it failed. There was no time to climb down, no way to jump clear. As the massive sections gave away, he was dragged with them. Now, this fall was catastrophic. A 242-foot tower obviously doesn't come down neatly. Segments twist as they collapse, colliding with each other, throwing off shards of metal and bolts like shrapnel. Chad would have been slammed violently against the steel he had been standing on only seconds before. His body, pulled by gravity, collided with pieces weighing thousands of pounds. Blunt force trauma isn't a single injury, and a collapse like this, it's dozens, each impact fracturing bone, crushing organs, and tearing flesh. Witnesses on the ground would have seen the horrifying sequence unfold. The tower crashed to earth with the violence of an earthquake, sending up a spray of dirt and debris. Somewhere inside the collapsing mass was Mitchell, still failing, still being struck by the structure as it pancaked onto itself. When it was over, the ridge that had held a rising turbine now held a heap of mangled steel. The noise would have echoed like thunder, then faded into stunned silence. Co-workers rushed forward, but the scene was chaos. Beams twisted into unrecognizable angles, bolts scattered across the ground, dust and smoke still hanging in the air. And buried in all that wreckage was Mitchell. He had sustained massive blunt force trauma. The human body cannot withstand the weight of collapsing steel, the violence of a fall from hundreds of feet, and the crushing impact of multiple strikes in rapid succession. Basically, as he was falling, he would be hit by the falling debris, which was obviously devastating, which he would not survive. Now, the question everyone asked was the same. How could an entire 242-foot tower just give away? These structures are designed to withstand decades of wind, storms, and mechanical stress once completed. Yet, during construction, they're not the same giants people see spinning on ridges. In those early stages, they are vulnerable. Wind turbines are built in massive sections of steel, each one lifted into the air by crane to the one below it, like I said in the beginning. Until all the pieces are in place and the tower is fully braced, the structure has weaknesses. A completed turbine is remarkably strong, but an unfinished tower is more like a balancing act, tall and narrow, with its stability depending on precise assembly and temporary support. Investigators later examined the Sherman County collapse and considered the possibilities. Perhaps bolts had not been tightened exactly to specification, or perhaps the bracing meant to steady the tower during assembly was inadequate. Out on the open plateau, gusts of wind can strike with sudden force, and even a 30-mile-per-hour side wind pressing against a 242-foot steel cylinder can turn it into a lever, bending and twisting until the metal gives away. There was also the chance that one of the sections carried a flaw from the factory, a warped plate, a bad weld that went unnoticed until the weight became too much. The most likely explanation was that the tower failed because it was unstable while still being erected. It was not the finished design that killed Chad Mitchell, but the fragile, in-between state of the structure. When tons of steel stood upright without the full reinforcement of a completed turbine, once one part shifted, the rest followed, collapsing in a chain reaction too fast for anyone to stop and too violent for anyone caught on it to survive. 5 teenagers stood together on the Dodge Road overpass in Genesee County, Michigan, as cars moved steadily along the interstate below. It was the evening of October 18th, 2017, and they were restless. Their ages ranged from 15 to 17, boys who should have been in school or at home, but instead had wandered into mischief. From their position above Interstate 75, they could see traffic streaming north and south, headlights tracing ribbons of light into the distance. They had come prepared with ammunition. Rocks and chunks of concrete had been collected from nearby, along with tires and scraps of metal. The idea was simple in their minds: drop heavy objects onto the freeway and watch what happens. As the first pieces of debris tumbled, they leaned over the railing, grinning as cars swerved or jolted under the impact. Glass cracked, metal dented with each collision, only encouraging them more. After they threw the objects, they would watch for hits. If a car was struck, they'd hurry off so the drivers below wouldn't catch sight of them. As the group continued their game, one of them, 17-year-old Kyle Anger, went further. He hefted a jagged rock weighing nearly 20 pounds. The others watched as he swung it up to the edge and released. The stone dropped fast, gaining speed with every foot it fell. Below, a van was moving northbound. In the passenger seat sat 32-year-old Kenneth White, returning home from a day at work. Beside him, a co-worker drove steadily through the evening traffic. Neither man had time to react. The rock punched through the windshield with explosive force. Glass shattered into hundreds of shards, spraying across the cabin like shrapnel. The driver was blinded, his skin cut, and his clothes peppered with fragments. For Kenneth, the impact was direct. The boulder-sized rock slammed onto his face and chest with devastating force, throwing his body back into the seat. The van veered as the driver struggled for control, covered in blood and glass. He somehow managed to steer to the shoulder, hard racing, but what he had saw beside him was beyond comprehension. Kenneth was slumped, his face mangled and swelling rapidly. Blood streamed from his mouth and wounds pulling across the dashboard. The rock was jagged and wet to where it had landed. Other drivers who had pulled over rushed to help, but the sight inside the van was shocking. One witness later described Kenneth as unrecognizable, his features destroyed by the impact. Emergency responders were called immediately. When paramedics arrived, the interior of the van looked like the aftermath of an explosion. The windshield was obliterated, blood sprayed across the interior, and Kenneth was motionless. Yet, he was not entirely gone. Faint movements and shallow breaths were noted, and it's even stated some bystanders reported hearing him moan softly. He was rushed to the Hurley Medical Center, but the extent of his injuries were already overwhelming. Trauma surgeons attempted resuscitation, fighting against catastrophic internal damage, but the autopsy would later describe his condition in detail. His skin had been fractured in multiple places. His jaw was shattered, the orbital bones surrounding his eyes had collapsed, leaving his face broken beyond recognition. His ribs were snapped and splintered, puncturing a limb, which collapsed. Blood filled his airway and chest cavity, with a massive hemothorax that suffocated him from the inside. His sternum was broken and his heart bruised, and vessels were ruptured. Doctors testified that even with the best trauma care, survival was merely impossible. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head and chest due to a rock through a windshield. The manner of death: homicide. Back at the Dodge Road overpass, police quickly pieced together what had happened. Debris littered the roadway, and witnesses reported seeing shadows on the bridge. Within days, all 5 teenagers were identified and arrested: Kyle Anger, along with Mark Seliski, McCaden Payne, Trevor Gray, and Alexander Miller. Prosecutors announced charges of second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit second-degree murder. In court, the forensic evidence was presented in stark detail. Jurors saw photographs of the van's obliterated windshield with its interior drenched in blood. They were shown the rock itself, still streaked with tissue. Doctors explained how a rock dropped from that height struck with the force of a sledgehammer, or in some calculations, the kinetic energy of a bullet from a high-powered rifle. One investigator told the jury bluntly, the rock didn't just strike Kenneth, it exploded through him. The family sat through every moment. Kenneth's mother later described the unbearable moment of walking into the hospital and seeing her son lying on a gurney, his face broken, tubes protruding, and sheets soaked red. His fiancée sobbed as she explained to the court how she had to tell their little boy that his father was never coming home. The teenagers' defense teams argued their clients had not fully understood the consequences of their actions. Some of the boys expressed remorse, though many in the public felt their apologies rang hollow. Ultimately, Kyle Anger, who threw the fatal rock, accepted a plea deal. He was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison. The others received lesser penalties: probation, community service, and in some cases, juvenile detention, for their roles in aiding and abetting. The case resonated far beyond Michigan. News outlets across the country reported it, and it was recorded in Wikipedia and discussed widely online. Drivers confessed they felt uneasy passing under bridges afterward, reminded that everyday routines can be shattered in an instant. For Kenneth White's family, the tragedy was deeply personal and lifelong. His son will grow up without his father, and his fiancée continues to carry the trauma of hospital corridors and broken promises. His parents live with the knowledge that their son's last moments were filled with violence and pain. The city of Rio de Janeiro is a place of contrast. Towering high-rises overlook sprawling favelas. Carnival parades and football matches bring joy, while at the same time, crime and violence cast long shadows. For decades, carjackings have been one of the darker realities of life in Rio. They happen so often that residents adopt habits. Doors locked at every stoplight, windows rolled up, and eyes scanning the mirrors for sudden movements. By 2007, these precautions were second nature to most families. On the evening of February 7th, 2007, a 6-year-old Sao Helio Fernandez was in the back seat of his mother's car. He had spent the day like many boys his age, happy, carefree, and enjoying his childhood. That night, his mother, his sister, and a family friend drove through the Oswaldo Cruz neighborhood in Rio. Zeo sat buckled into the seat, his seatbelt clipped across his lap. He was secure and safe in his mother's eyes, protected by the most ordinary of safety devices. Then, in a heartbeat, everything changed. A group of 5 young men, some barely older than teenagers, spotted the car. Armed and looking for a target, they surrounded the vehicle. In Rio, carjackings often unfold with terrifying speed. Drivers are dragged out, sometimes beaten, and sometimes shot. The criminals shoved Zeo's mother out of the driver's seat, and in the chaos, they didn't bother to check the back. They didn't notice Zeo, strapped in, too small to undo his seatbelt quickly. His sister scrambled out, terrified. The criminals slammed the door, jumped inside, and sped off into the night. What happened next defies comprehension. Zeo's seatbelt had become twisted and snagged as he tried to get out. When the door shut, part of the belt looped outside the car, and as the vehicle accelerated, his small body was pulled out of the seat. Instead of falling free, he was dragged, tethered to the speeding car by the strap, and this car would not stop. For the next 7 kilometers, over 4 miles, the criminals tore through the streets of Rio, dragging the 6-year-old across pavement, gutters, and curbs. Witnesses later said they could hear the screams. Residents came out of their homes to the sound of tires screeching and a child's voice, shrill with terror and pain, echoing in the night. Zeo's body slammed into obstacles, the ground metal posts, even parked cars. Skin tore away, bones shattered, and fingers and knees were ripped off against the pavement. His head struck repeatedly until it was crushed. Those who saw him described it as a nightmare. His body was reduced to a trail of blood and torn flesh, unrecognizable by the time the car finally stopped. What makes the horror so much worse is that he did not die instantly. People on the roadside, paralyzed by shock, reported him conscious during parts of the ordeal. They saw him flailing, heard his screams cut short, and watched in helpless disbelief as the car dragged him further and farther. Minutes stretched into an eternity, every second another blow against his small body. By the time he finally succumbed, the suffering he had endured was almost unimaginable. Alive, screaming, mutilated by piece by the unforgiving pavement of Rio. When the criminals finally realized what had happened, they abandoned the car and fled on foot. Zeo's mutilated remains were left behind, still tangled in the seatbelt. The news of the crime spread across Brazil almost instantly. Television broadcasts and newspapers showed images of the abandoned car and described the brutal sequence of events. The country was shocked. Rio, a city already accustomed to violence, recoiled at the details of what the 6-year-old had to endure. Vigils were held in his name, thousands marched in the streets carrying candles and calling for justice. His name became a rallying cry for a society demanding protection for its children. The judicial process moved quickly. The assailants were quickly identified, 5 young men, some minors under Brazilian law. The fact that one of the killers were under 18 ignited a national firestorm. Under Brazil's statutes, minors could not be tried as adults, no matter the crime. The idea that a boy could be dragged to death for miles, with his body being destroyed while criminals laughed and kept driving, and yet the perpetrators might only serve a few years in detention, outraged the public. Citizens called for reforms to Brazil's laws on juvenile crime. In court, the details were laid bare. Forensic experts testified about the extent of Zeo's injuries. Loss of limbs, shredded flesh, skull fractures, and catastrophic trauma incompatible with life. The seatbelt strap, examined in evidence, showed how it had locked tight, preventing his escape. Judges and attorneys struggled to maintain composure. Killers were eventually convicted, though the sentencing varied because of their ages. The adults received prison terms. The younger offenders, including the minor, were sentenced to detention and youth facilities, meaning they one day could walk free. For Zeo's family, no punishment could balance the scales. His mother lived with the image of her child being torn from the car, in his final moments spent screaming on the streets. His sister carried survivor's guilt, haunted by the night she climbed out while her brother remained strapped inside. The streets where he was dragged or washed and cleaned, and the blood scrubbed away. In Central Florida, the summer air in July presses down heavy and hot, the kind of heat that hums with insects and leaves sweat clinging to the skin. In the small community of Highway Park, near Lake Placid, life moved quickly. Families lived in modest homes, with yards running against patches of woodland. Cars rumbled along the back roads, and dogs barked in the distance, their voices carrying across the humid evening. People there were used to the rhythms of rural Florida, where space was wide and neighbors knew one another, where the woods at the edge of town gave both shelter and a sense of unease. Stray animals wandered freely, sometimes tolerated, sometimes avoided, depending on how bold they became. On the afternoon of July 4th, 2019, 45-year-old Melvin Olds Jr. walked through one of those wooded areas behind a home. It was a holiday that day, and as fireworks cracked elsewhere across the state, Melvin moved along the shaded path, surrounded by the tall grass and trees that swayed only slightly in the still, humid air. Now, it's not known why he did this. He probably just wanted to go for a walk, but it was there, away from the roads and the houses, that he encountered the animals. There were not just one or two strays out wandering for food or water. There were several moving together, acting as a unit. There were dogs, and packs of dogs behave differently than individuals. Alone, hesitation remains, but in a group, the drive to chase, surround, and dominate becomes stronger. Their instincts sharpen in numbers, and the fear of approaching a human overshadowed by the confidence of the pack. And these dogs were very confident and really violent. The first bites were not the end, but the beginning. This was not an attack that stopped quickly. It unfolded in waves, the dog circling, lunging, and tearing, and retreating only to come again. When rescuers later examined Melvin's body, they counted more than 100 bite wounds. The sheer number spoke of the ordeal's length. Every few seconds brought another set of teeth, another rip of flesh, and another joint of pain. The attack was not swift or merciful, it was sustained and unrelenting. Although he tried to fight, the evidence of his struggle was written on his body. Deep puncture wounds marked his forearms and hands, where he had lifted to block the snapping jaws. But with each passing movement, blood loss increased, weakness grew, and the odds of survival shrank. Even a strong, healthy man could not withstand 5 or 6 dogs clamped down at once, each bite stripping away more strength. Now, someone must have heard his screams because the paramedics would arrive. But by the time they did reach him, there was nothing to be done. The ground around him was stained with the blood he had lost. His clothing was shredded, soaked through, no longer protecting him, but clinging in tatters to a body ravaged by the attack. The medical examiner who later reviewed the case confirmed what the scene already suggested. He had died from blood loss and shock brought on by the sheer number of wounds. Over 100 separate injuries covered him, some shallow tears, but others gouges deep into muscle, some clustered on his arms and legs, others tearing into his torso and even around his neck and head. Each one on its own might have been survivable, but together they formed a pattern of trauma nobody could endure. The details of the autopsy added even more horror to what had already been uncovered. More than half of the bite marks showed signs of tearing, evidence that the dogs had not simply bitten down, but had shaken their heads violently, ripping skin and muscle away in chunks. Some wounds overlapped, as if more than one dog had latched onto the same place at once. Investigators described the injuries as extensive and brutal, noting that his body bore the signs of a prolonged fight rather than an instant death. Authorities would act quickly. 6 dogs were captured in the days that were followed. They were described as pit bull mixes, roaming unsupervised in the area. DNA testing was ordered to determine whether they were the ones responsible, though the size and shape of the bite marks already appeared to match. Regardless of the results, their fates were sealed. Animals implicated in fatal maulings are almost always killed, but investigators wanted certainty, for the record, for the family, and for the community that needed answers, which it turned out they were, and after finding that out, they were killed. The broader context of the case pointed to a problem that had plagued Florida for years. Rural counties with large expanses of unfenced land and limited animal control resources often see packs form when unneutered and unwanted dogs are abandoned. Once a group establishes itself, they no longer behave like pets. They hunt livestock, they scavenge, and in rare but catastrophic instances, they turn on people. Even though these attacks are uncommon, when they happen, they expose the fragile line between domesticated animal and predator. Star Lake, Putnam County, Florida is ringed with docks and modest lakeside homes, where families often spend weekends fishing, swimming, and pulling children on tubes behind boats or jet skis. On summer afternoons, the water hums with engines and echoes with laughter, a scene that feels routine in a community where recreational boating is part of everyday life. On one such afternoon in 2025, 3 children climbed onto a large inflatable tube tethered to a jet ski. They strapped on life vests, gripped the handles, and prepared for an ordinary ride across the water. The operator of the jet ski was a man in his 70s. He was experienced enough to guide the craft and likely thought of little risk as he pulled away from shore. The tube skimmed across the surface, bouncing in the wake as the children shouted and clung to their grips. To anyone watching from the nearby homes or docks, it looked no different from countless other tubing sessions on Florida lakes. The speed was moderate and the water was relatively calm, and the children appeared secure in their gear. Yet tubing carries a hidden danger in the way the tow line handles momentum. When a watercraft turns, the tube behind it does not pivot neatly. Instead, it swings outward in a wide arc, gaining extra speed. The tighter and faster the turn, the harder the tube whips across the surface. Experienced operators know to keep turns gradual and away from fixed structures. But on Star Lake that day, the turn was sharp and the dock that jutted from the shoreline was too close. The tube carrying all 3 children hurtled toward it, and that collision was violent. The inflatable slammed into the deck with full force, with the impact amplified by the speed of the swing. For the children strapped in life vests, there was no chance to shield themselves. Their small bodies were driven into the hard structure, bones and organs absorbing energy that the tube itself could not cushion. The sound of the crash startled neighbors, who turned to see chaos erupt where moments before there had only been play. Those who rushed forward found a scene of devastation. 9-year-old Andrew Bach had taken the brunt of the impact. His body was broken and his injuries were catastrophic. He was unresponsive when pulled from the wreckage, bleeding heavily, with his face and torso bearing the marks of blunt force trauma. His 10-year-old brother was also injured, crying out in pain but still conscious. 11-year-old Kaylon Bass suffered serious wounds that would require extended hospitalization at UF Health Shands. All 3 had been wearing life vests, but the safety gear offered no protection against the crushing blow of wood and speed. First responders were called to Star Lake and arrived quickly, but for Andrew there was little they could do. The trauma he had sustained was beyond belief. The trauma he had sustained was beyond emergency medicine could repair. Life vests are designed to keep children afloat and prevent drowning, but they can't stop ribs from snapping, skulls from fracturing, or organs from rupturing when bodies collide with immovable structures at high velocity. Investigators later confirmed that his death was the direct result of blunt force trauma from the collision. The authorities from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission opened an investigation into the crash. Their findings confirmed the sequence of events. The tube had been pulled into a turn too close to a dock. The swing had carried it into the structure, and the impact caused fatal and serious injuries. The operator of the jet ski, though uninjured, became the focus of scrutiny. At his age, he may have had the experience, but the judgment, a sharp turn, near a fixed object, was questioned by officials and community members alike. Understanding the mechanics of what happened helps explain the scale of the tragedy. When a tube swings behind a tow vehicle, its speeds can nearly double compared to that of the craft itself. A jet ski traveling 20 miles per hour may send its tube whipping across the surface at 30 or more. A collision at that velocity generates forces comparable to a car crash, but without seatbelts, airbags, or helmets. The only barrier between flesh and dock that day was the thin nylon and vinyl skin of the inflatable, which did nothing to slow the impact. Kaylon Bass remained hospitalized for weeks, recovering from injuries that were not fully detailed in official releases, but were described as serious. The 10-year-old brother was treated and released. Both surviving boys faced not only physical healing, but the psychological burden of having lived through the accident. Survivors of such traumatic events often experience flashbacks, anxiety around water, and lasting fear that can take years of counseling to address. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission has yet to announce where the criminal charges will be filed, but investigations into boating deaths often raise the question of negligence. If an operator fails to exercise reasonable care, such as by steering too close to docks, turning too sharply or endangering passengers, they can face legal consequences. Civil lawsuits are also common in such cases, as families seek accountability and compensation for their losses. For Andrew's family, the loss was immediate and irreparable. One son was dead, another was injured, and a family friend was in the hospital with severe wounds. London in the mid-2000s was a city in transition. New buildings were rising, transport systems were being overhauled, and the streets that had carried red double-deckers for generations now hosted something entirely different. The articulated bendy bus. Introduced in 2002 and championed by then-Mayor Ken Livingstone, these long-jointed buses were meant to modernize the network. They could carry over 100 passengers, loading them quickly through multiple doors, with their elongated frames snaking around corners like an enormous red caterpillar. But to many Londoners, they were intimidating. They clogged intersections, stretched across lanes, and when accidents happened, they were more often serious than anything involving the city's traditional double-deckers. One of the busiest routes where these buses ran was the 25, a line connecting central London through Whitechapel, Stratford, Ilford, and out towards East London's residential sprawl. It was a lifeline for thousands of people a day, and by night it became a night bus, ferrying shift workers, partygoers, and residents home through the dark hours when the tube was shut. If you lived near Ilford or Manor Park, chances you knew the 25 well. Its crowded seats, the smell of damp coats, and fried food clinging to passengers, and the way its wheels hissed against the tarmac on Romford Road. In the early morning of October 9th, 2007, one of those buses pulled away from a shop along that stretch of Romford Road. The streetlights cast pale circles on the pavement, and traffic was sparse, only the occasional car and the steady passage of buses making their way east. The city was quiet, hanging in the fragile stillness between the last of the night and the first stirrings of the day. Inside the articulated bus, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating the handful of passengers who rode in near silence. Among them was 20-year-old Lee Beckwith, a tiler from Brentwood, Essex, traveling with a friend. At that hour, the ride must have felt ordinary, even dull. The rumble of the engine, the sway of the long frame, and the stretch of Romford Road rolling past outside. The bus stopped again, its hydraulic brakes exhaling a hiss into the cool night air. Doors folded open with a mechanical clatter, and passengers shifted in their seats. Lee rose, moving toward the exit and preparing to step off onto the pavement. Nothing about that action should have been dangerous. Millions of people step off buses every day without incident. But in that moment, something went wrong. Maybe it was the angle of the step, or maybe his foot just slipped. Whatever it was, Lee lost his balance. And instead of landing safely on the pavement, his body fell into the lethal space between man and machine. The massive wheels were already turning as the driver pulled away, and Lee was dragged beneath the articulated bus. Now, the machinery of a vehicle like this is merciless. The sheer size and weight of a bendy bus, over 18 meters long, weighing many tons, means that once someone is caught under it, there is almost no chance of escape unless the driver stops immediately. But on Romford Road that morning, the bus did not stop. The driver, apparently unaware of what had just happened, continued forward, leaving Lee trapped underneath. The wheels crushed down onto him, the weight snapping bones on contact. His body was pinned to the asphalt, with his skin tearing open instantly as he was dragged along the road. The friction shredded his clothing and then his flesh, leaving his skin flayed from muscle. Basically, his muscle was scraped down to the bone. His ribs splintered under the constant grinding, with fragments puncturing his lungs. His arms and legs were twisted grotesquely, with ligaments tearing as the force of the moving bus wrenched him into an unnatural position. The bus continued to roll on, pulling him relentlessly forward. Every rotation of the wheels battered him further, grinding his body against the rough surface. His face struck the pavement again and again, leaving a bloody smear across the tarmac. The constant dragging stripped away layers of tissue, leaving raw bone exposed in places, with blood being poured out and a steady trail behind the bus, with dark streaks marking the path of his final moments. The sound of the engine and the hum of the tires masked everything. The handful of passengers inside had no idea what was unfolding below. Street after street passed as the vehicle rumbled forward, and beneath it, Lee's body was battered and torn apart in silence. Reports later said he was dragged for more than a mile, Try to imagine that distance, measured not in minutes but in the grinding of pavement against skin and in the weight of steel pressing into bone and the roar of the vehicle moving steadily forward while a young man lay trapped beneath. His body was transformed with every passing yard from a living man into a broken, bloodied form scraped raw against the road. The streets at that hour were quiet, which meant no one was there to wave the bus down and no one to raise any alarm. It was only the sound of the vehicle fading into the distance, leaving behind the silence of a city still asleep. Eventually, Lee's body became dislodged and was left on the road. The bus carried on, and its driver still apparently unaware. It was a passerby who came upon the scene minutes later. Imagine walking along the road in the dawn's dim light, expecting emptiness, and instead encountering the aftermath of something so violent and incomprehensible. What they saw was devastating. A young man's body, clothes shredded, skin torn away, blood pooling beneath, and a long, grotesque trail of red marking the road behind. His features were mangled and his limbs were bent unnaturally, his flesh ripped apart by more than a mile of grinding asphalt. Emergency services were called, but it was already too late. His injuries, being crushed chest, broken spine, torn organs, skin flayed from the dragging, were catastrophic, and no medical response could ever undo what happened beneath the bus. News of this accident spread quickly through Ilford and beyond. Headlines told the bare facts. A 21-year-old man killed in a bus accident, dragged more than a mile along Romford Road. The bus driver was arrested on suspicion of causing death by dangerous driving, though the final outcome of that case, at least to my understanding, has remained less clear in public memory. What endured was the debate about the buses themselves. Bending buses had always been controversial, and this accident threw fuel onto the fire. Critics pointed to their blind spots, their unwieldy length, and their difficulty navigating London's narrower roads. The fact that such a tragedy could occur and go unnoticed by a driver for over a mile seemed to prove their point. And just to restate, the bus driver was arrested, but I haven't been able to find if he got prison time or not. There just isn't a clear public record, at least what I found. But by the early 2010s, London phased out bending buses altogether. Officially, the decision rested on operational costs, fare evasion problems, and general safety concerns. Florida afternoons often carry a weight of their own. The air hangs thick, sticky with humidity, and in residential streets, the sound of cicadas buzzes beneath the more mechanical hum of engines. Palm Bay, tucked along the state's east coast, looks calm from a distance, a city of neighborhoods and narrow roads lined with tidy yards. But when roadwork comes to one of those streets, that calm changes. Heavy trucks and machines fill the space. Cones and barricades mark off the pavement, and the smell of hot asphalt clings in the air. To a passing driver, it might look routine, but for the men standing near the machines, there's always a shadow of risk. On Tuesday, December 10th, 2024, that risk turned into something irreversible on Satan Wood Court Northeast. The street itself was small and unassuming, one of the countless roads being resurfaced that season. Crews from Timothy Rose Construction had been there through the day, laying down new asphalt. First came the paver, the machine that spreads a layer of hot black top and a steady ribbon. Then came the roller, the hulking vehicle that presses the mat flat, its smooth steel drum weighing down with crushing force to ensure the surface binds tight. Together they moved like a slow parade, advancing foot by foot. Among the men on the ground was 62-year-old Noel Allsworth Solin of Fort Pierce. At his age, some would have stepped away from heavy labor, but Noel had worked construction for decades. He was steady and dependable, someone who kept showing up. That afternoon, he was doing what he had done countless times before, moving with the crew and working alongside the machines. But the relationship between man and machine on a paving job is always fragile. The roller especially carries danger. It doesn't move fast, it creeps along at walking speed, but its weight is crushing. One mistake, one slip into its path, and the outcome is, well, catastrophic. So, at around 3:23 p.m., the roller was repositioning behind the paver. Its backup alarm wailed with that piercing beep 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 that's supposed to warn anyone behind, but on a live site, noise stacks together. The deep growl of engines, the buzz of the screed, men calling to each other, and radios crackling. In that ball of sound, a man could be lost in the blind spot. That was the moment Noel ended up directly behind the roller. Whether he stepped into the path to check something on the mat or was simply just too close when the operator began reversing was really unclear. But he was suddenly in the machine's shadow. The drum touched him, then it pressed. The front edge of the roller's steel drum caught Noel across the stomach, shoving him backward, and it didn't stop. The tonnage of the machine pushed down into his abdomen with unstoppable force. His ribs gave out almost instantly, snapping in succession like sticks under a boot. His pelvis shattered as the weight advanced, his liver splitting, intestines crushed with blood vessels tearing open in bursts. The roller rolled over him from his stomach downward. His torso collapsed beneath the pressure, his lungs being forced flat, and air exploding from his mouth and a gurgle sound. Blood rushed into his chest cavity and sprayed from his lips. His legs twisted grotesquely under the drum, with his skin splintering where jagged bones pushed through. Muscle and flesh were torn apart as the crushing drum pressed them into the hot asphalt. The men around him screamed, their shouts mixing with the beeping alarm and the engine's drone. The operator slammed on the brakes, with the machine groaning to a halt, but the damage was already done. Co-workers rushed forward, their boots slipping on the fresh tar, and clawed at his body trying to drag him free. What they pulled out was a broken man beyond recognition. His chest was caved inward, his stomach torn, and his lower body mangled. His eye visibility vest was soaked red, with his clothes ripped open by the violence of the crush. His arms lay limp at his sides, and his legs bent at impossible angles. They dropped to their knees in the road trying CPR, palms pressed against the sternum that had been shattered, ribs grinding under their hands. Each compression forced more blood to bubble from his mouth and nose. Oxygen just wouldn't take because his lungs had collapsed, filling with fluid and blood. His skin was pale, his eyes half closed. When Palm Bay Fire and police arrived, the scene was chaos. The roller idling in place, workers slick with sweat and blood, and paramedics shouting as they cut through clothes from Noel's crushed body. They pushed air into him, forcing oxygen down a throat filled with blood. They jabbed IVs, tried to find a pulse, but every push on the chest only forced more blood from his mouth. So the injuries were just too massive. Crushed ribs, ruptured organs, pelvis in pieces, and legs mangled. Within minutes, the paramedics made the call. Noel was dead at the scene. The silence afterward was thick. The roller's engine ticked as it cooled, with the air stank of tar and blood. The pavement beneath him was marked forever. Black asphalt streaked with red, fingerprints and nail marks pressed into the surface. The place where life had been crushed out of him. The official reports came later. Local news described a worker pinned under a roller. Equipment World published an account. A 62-year-old man run over by an asphalt roller from the stomach down, but unable to survive. OSHA opened an investigation, noting simply, employee was operating near a paver and was run over by roller. Fatal crush injuries to lower body. The clinical phrasing flattened the horror into a single line. So I could not find any credible evidence and the public reporting that the operator or any individual was arrested for the construction accident. None of the news sources I checked mentioned any charges or any arrests. Also, I did not find any information confirming that someone lost their job as a result of the accident or was terminated. Although it's uncommon to see any immediate arrests unless there's alcohol, fleeing, or clearly reckless conduct. Most consequences, if any, come later via OSHA enforcement, fines or citations, not criminal charges. Nor did I find anywhere that OSHA fined the company or anything. In Vidor, Texas, the nights carry a weight all their own. The air doesn't cool much even after midnight. It clings, damp, warm, a heaviness that presses into skin and slows everything down. Once most of the town has gone to bed, the roads go quiet except for the occasional passing truck, and the canals that cut through the land turn into black mirrors, holding faint reflections of the moon and stars. The silence, although, is deceptive. On the surface it feels calm, but in the shadows, the canals always wait. It was on such a night, May 4th, 2025, that 20-year-old Hunter Wayne Korikink went riding with two friends in a side-by-side utility vehicle. In places like Vidor, these machines are everywhere. Open-sided, steel-framed, rattling boxes of power used for both work and play. They chew through pastures and bounce down dirt roads. They're practically on farms and equally suited for a midnight ride along the narrow strips of ground running beside canals. The machines are loud, with their engines buzzing hard enough to split the quiet. Their headlights are basically jerking cones of light across the dirt with every rut in the path. Hunter sat with a young man driving and a young woman beside them. The three moved west along the canal near South Terry Road and Concord Street. The dirt was uneven, with the path narrow, but to them it must have felt like nothing unusual. The canal reflected the shaky beams of light, broken occasionally when an insect skimmed the surface. The bank looked firm enough, though it was only dirt and roots packed against the water's edge. Now, it doesn't take much for the ground there to give away. But in that moment, none of them thought about that. The side-by-side rattled onward with the engine humming. The Ordinary felt secure, but the night was already shifting. The first sign came quick. The driver spotted a deep hole ahead, a rut carved into the dirt that could slam the machine hard if they went over it. So he reacted fast, turning sharply to avoid it. But that snap of the wheel carried the vehicle closer to the canal's edge, and the tires bit into soil that was looser than it looked. The ground crumbled in clumps, and the frame tilted with a groan of strained metal. Headlights swung toward the canal, with beams catching the faint ripple of water waiting below. Now, Hunter didn't freeze. He launched forward, boots slamming into the slope, with hands locking around the roll cage as he tried to hold the machine upright. His body braced against the tilt, with his muscles straining as though sheer strength could drag it back from the brink. He wasn't thinking about himself. His instinct was to save the others. For one moment, the machine hung there in balance, although groaning under the weight. But then the dirt gave way, and gravity finished the job. The side-by-side then rolled into the canal. The sound was violent, shattering the silence of the night. Water exploded upward in a spray that slapped the bank and soaked the grass. The headlights plunged beneath the surface, with beams scattering into ghostly ribbons before snapping out. The roll cage slammed down with a sickening crunch, striking Hunter and driving beneath the surface. The force was crushing. The cage pinned him chest down into the sucking mud of the canal bottom. His ribs cracked like dry sticks, with his sternum collapsing under the weight. Organs ruptured inside him, with the impact forcing blood to surge into his chest cavity. His legs twisted beneath the steel, skin ripping open where jagged edges tore through flesh. The mud beneath him swallowed what bled out, with dark clouds rising in the water. Above, air burst upward in frantic bubbles, the last rush from his lungs forced out by the crushing impact. They fizzled at the surface, breaking apart as his friend screamed his name. The driver and the woman scrambled, slipping on wet earth, clawing at the tilted machine. Their fingers slid uselessly across cold, slick metal. Every heave and tug left them smeared in blood, their palms raw, but the cage didn't shift. Hunter remained pinned beneath, his body thrashing weakly in those first seconds, instinct trying to fight even as the weight crushed the air from his lungs. Water poured into his mouth and nose, filling him as he drowned under the roll cage. He gagged and convulsed beneath the surface, with his chest heaving violently for oxygen that wasn't there. His movement slowed as blood mixed with water, with his lungs collapsing further. His vision dimmed into the darkness. Above the surface, panic was chaos. His friends screamed louder, with their voices cracking in desperation. They shoved against the steel, splashed into the canal, water knee-deep, slipping and choking on the water themselves as they tried to grab him. But the machine was just too heavy, locked down by suction and its own 1,000-pound weight. The canal gave them nothing back but silence and the occasional gurgle of bubbles breaking the surface. Minutes stretched on. Neighbors woke to the sound of screams. They grabbed flashlights and ran barefoot or half-dressed into the night. Beams of light slashed across the canal, catching the gleam of wet steel, the pale faces of the young survivors, and the froth-disturbed water. Some neighbors waded in too, mud sucking at their feet as they tried to push and haul the machine, their grunts mixing with the cries of Hunter's name, but nothing moved and the machine held its grip. Then finally, sirens cut through the night. Deputies and paramedics stormed onto the scene, boots flashing, radios buzzing, and orders being shouted. They grabbed ropes, lights, and whatever tools they had, and entered the water. For long moments, it looked hopeless. The roll cage was set deep, suctioned in place like a stone. Then, with a loud groan and a surge of bubbles, it shifted. Rescuers shouted as they dragged Hunter's limp body out of the black water. They laid him flat in the wet grass, his body soaked and heavy. Water poured from his mouth, mixed with blood that slipped from his lips, with his ribs broken in jagged lines beneath pale skin. His legs were twisted and mangled from the weight, deep gashes running across his thighs and calves. Paramedics bent low, pressing against his sternum, forcing compressions, but his chest refused to rise. Oxygen hissed from a mask as they tried to flood air back into his drowned lungs. They then rushed him into an ambulance, with sirens splinting the darkness as they sped him toward Christus St. Elizabeth Hospital in Beaumont. Doctors worked furiously to bring him back, but the crushing force of that roll cage and the long minutes submerged had already taken everything. His chest had basically been destroyed, with his lungs filled and his organs fatally damaged. At 20 years old, Hunter Wayne Cornick was pronounced dead. The report afterward was this: a utility vehicle swerved to avoid a hole, tipped into a canal, and a young man was pinned beneath. But the truth that night wasn't paper-thin words. It was a violent crash of steel into water. It was ribs snapping like glass, and it was air boiling to the surface and desperate bubbles. It was friends screaming his name while the canal swallowed him, and it was his body being dragged out into the grass, broken as paramedics fought against time they had already run out. Craig Harlan Gotham was 55 years old, and he lived in a small farming town in Illinois called Manitou. If you're not from that part of the Midwest, you might not even know a place like that exists. It's mostly fields along flat roads, a handful of businesses, and people who spend their days working the land or running local shops. But on August 5th, 2020, Craig wasn't in Manitou, several hours south at a spot that couldn't feel more different than the quiet farm fields back home. He was at Lake of the Ozarks. If you've never heard of it, this isn't some small fishing lake. It's a massive twisting reservoir created when a dam was built on the Osage River back in the 1930s. Over time, it became one of the busiest recreational lakes in the Midwest. Picture over 1,000 miles of shoreline, resorts and rental houses everywhere, restaurants you can pull a boat up to, and in summer the water jammed with pontoons, fishing boats, speedboats, and jet skis. It's loud, crowded, and alive. For people like Craig, who came from towns where the biggest noise most days was a tractor or a passing semi, the lake was something entirely different, an escape. Now, he had brought his boat with him, a 4 Winds 240 Horizon. That's a 24-foot fiberglass runabout, the kind of boat you trailer behind a pickup. It's not huge like a yacht, but not small either, roomy enough for family or friends, and with the power to push through big lake water. Boats like that are built for days exactly like this, cruising channels, stopping in coves, then heading back out again. On board, you'd find the standard gear: life jackets, ropes, coolers, and an anchor stored up near the bow. An anchor is simple in concept, but dangerous if handled wrong. It's heavy steel, shaped to catch the bottom. When you want to stop and hold your position, maybe for swimming or just drifting without moving, you drop it over the front of the boat, pay out rope, and let it dig into the lake bed. It keeps you from sliding around, but the rule every boater learns early is this: never ever move the boat forward with the anchor still down. That anchor becomes a dead weight, with the rope becoming a line under tension, and the forces involved are far greater than most people realize. At some point that day, Craig had used his anchor. That part is clear because later it would still be in the water. Maybe he had stopped in a quiet cove to rest, maybe he had taken a break before heading back out into the main channel. What matters is that when he left again, when he put the throttle down and aimed the bow into the broad open water, the anchor hadn't fully been brought back up. From the helm, it wouldn't have been obvious right away. The boat still moves, with the engine still pushing. To anyone watching from another boat or from shore, it looks completely normal. A man in his mid-50s standing at the wheel, staring down the main channel on a warm August afternoon. His posture steady, one hand on the wheel, the other near the throttle with his eyes forward. Just another boat among dozens, nothing unusual at all. But beneath the surface, that anchor dragged against the bottom. The rope stretched out and pulled tight, resisting every foot of the forward movement. And ropes under strain don't just sit still. They hum, they vibrate, and they twitch like they're alive. With each fiber holding back force it's not meant to carry for long. So the faster the boat moved, the more energy stored in that line. It was, in essence, a giant spring waiting to be released. Imagine stretching a rubber band until it's about to snap, except this wasn't a rubber band. It was a thick anchor line tied to steel weighing enough to hold a 24 boat in place. That tension built second by second, hidden below unnoticed by the man steering ahead. And then it let go. The anchor ripped free from the bottom all at once. The rope recoiled like a slingshot, releasing all the force it had built up in a single violent motion. The anchor didn't just rise gently out of the water, it hurled upward with the line whipping it like a weapon. In less than a second, it cleared the bow and came straight toward the helm, and the steel slammed into Craig's head. The sound would have been shocking, the crack of metal colliding with bone louder than you'd ever expect. The blow shattered his skull instantly, with blood spraying across the deck, splattering against the interior, the windshield, and even into the air before falling back in drops. His body collapsed with his legs giving out, his arms loose, and the life knocked out of him in a single hit. This wasn't a glancing strike, it was direct, brutal, and final. Like I said before, anchors are built heavy for a reason. They're supposed to resist current and hold a boat steady. And with all that weight and all that mass, was now driving into the fragile structure of a human head at incredible speed. His skull fractured, caving in under the impact. The skin tore open, with blood pouring out onto the sheets, staining the fiberglass beneath him red. Anyone nearby would have seen it in horrifying clarity. One moment he was upright, steady at the wheel, and the next his body crumbled to the side, blood rushing, with the anchor clattering back down after its arc. The engine kept running and the boat was still moving forward, but its operator was slumped and bleeding heavily. On the deck, the scene was gruesome. Blood pooled near where he fell, slick across the non-slip surface. His hair matted instantly, the wound on his head open and catastrophic. This wasn't the kind of injury you patch up with bandages or even hope to stabilize. It was a fatal strike, the kind you see in industrial accidents, where a machine delivers more force than the human body can ever withstand. And yet, in that moment, people still rushed to act. Calls for help went out. Emergency services were alerted. Boats are often close enough on the lake that others see when something goes wrong, and the urgency would have been clear. A man down, struck massive head trauma. Craig was transported to the Lake Regional Hospital in Osage Beach. He was still alive when they moved him, but barely. The damage to his head and brain was just too severe. Less than 2 hours after the anchor struck him, doctors pronounced him dead at 7:04 p.m. The Missouri State Highway Patrol investigated, as they do with all serious accidents on the lake. The description was stark and simple. The boat was under power with the anchor still in the water. The rope pulled tight and the anchor released and catapulted out, striking the operator in the head. That was the entire chain of events. No alcohol, no storm, and no collision with another vessel. Just like many other cases, one oversight. One anchor not raised, and the physics of tension and release turning it into a weapon. Work inside a steel casting plant doesn't look like most jobs people picture when they think of factory work. It isn't a quiet assembly line or an air-conditioned warehouse. It's hot, heavy, and dangerous. In places like Elwood Engineered Casting in Hubbard Township, Ohio, workers handle molten steel heated to nearly 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Imagine lava spilling from a volcano. That's about what's being moved inside these buildings every day, except instead of flowing naturally, it's poured and shaped by men and women who have to stand near it. The steel arrives in giant ladles, suspended by cranes, and is poured into molds to make parts used in trains, heavy equipment, or industrial machines. The job requires constant cleaning, moving, and adjusting. Hoses spraying water, machines vibrating, and cranes shifting overhead. And every single step has risks. Heat alone can blister skin from several feet away. A spill can turn fatal instantly. Steam explosions, equipment failures, or human errors can unleash violence in a second. The Bureau of Labor Statistics records workplace fatalities in the United States every year. Manufacturing ranks consistently high, and foundries where molten metal is poured and shaped are some of the worst. Hundreds of workers are killed annually in heavy manufacturing, and thousands more are injured. Between 2011 and 2019, the US averaged more than 350 deaths per year in manufacturing settings, with dozens specifically in metal production. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration has cited molten metal facilities repeatedly for violations because accidents are so often catastrophic. There's rarely such a thing as a minor injury when you're dealing with liquid steel hot enough to melt flesh and bone on contact. This is the world Ja Waylon T. Patterson walked into. He was 30 years old, working at Elwood Engineered Casting. On January 13th, 2024, he was in the pit, a lower area beneath where molten steel was being poured, with a hose in his hands. His job was to wash down leaks in the casting process, basically keeping things clean and controlled as the liquid metal moved from the ladles into molds. It was still dark outside just before 5 in the morning, when most people were still in bed. Inside the plant though, the work was already underway. Above him, a malfunction started. Molten steel nearly 3,000 degrees began leaking into the pit where he stood. Someone shouted and a crane moved the ladle to try to stop the flow. Ja Whalen was below, spraying and doing the routine task he had done before. But molten metal doesn't wait. When it spills, it floods, and in that pit, there was nowhere safe to go. In a blink of an eye, tons of liquid steel poured downward. It splashed, hissed, and surged like a wave of fire, and Jay Whalen was trapped. The hose in his hand was useless against something that hot and that violent. He couldn't climb out fast enough, and the molten steel engulfed him. Obviously, the human body can't withstand contact with such temperatures. Even being within feet of molten steel can cause second and third degree burns, with direct contact being way worse than fire. It destroys tissue instantly, burning through skin, muscle, and bone. Witnesses later reported he was incinerated almost immediately, with the steel filling the pit and consuming everything in it. There was no chance for him to escape, no moment to shield himself. One instant he was working, the next he was gone. Co-workers who saw it described the chaos, people yelling, others scrambling back, and the heat forcing them away even as they wanted to help. The plant shut down in shock, and by the time emergency responders did arrive, there was nothing they could do. Ja Whalen Patterson was dead. The aftermath revealed even more horror. OSHA investigated and found that death had been preventable. The company had failed to follow basic safety procedures. There was no proper confined space program, inadequate training, and no clear process for dealing with leaks of molten metal. Elwood Engineered Casting was cited for 11 serious violations, and fines totaling more than $145,000 were issued, but fines mean little compared to a life lost. To understand the magnitude of what happened, you have to picture it second by second. Patterson in the pit spraying down a leak, the sound of molten steel dripping, a hiss as it hit moisture, a vibration through the floor, then the surge, liquid metal pouring down, splashing outward, glowing orange-white in the dim early morning light. He would have seen it in only an instant before it hit, basically a wall of fire rolling toward him. The heat alone would have scorched his skin before the steel even touched, and when it touched, there was no surviving that. What's kinda sad to think about is his death was one of the thousands and dangerous jobs across the US every year. The truth is, most people never think about what it takes to make the metal in their cars, their trains, and their machines. They don't see the men like Ja Whalen Patterson who stand in pits at 5 in the morning holding hoses while liquid steel flows above them. But it has to be done, and sometimes it comes at a cost. At only 30 years old, Patterson left behind a fiancée and 2 young children. He was remembered as someone with humor, compassion, and a giving nature. Those things matter, but so does the way he died. Because his death wasn't just a random bad luck. It was the direct result of an industry where hazards are well known and where safety failures are often brushed aside until tragedy forces change. By the time he was in his late 50s, Carlos Len had worked more than his share of hard jobs. He was 57 years old in 2020, living in rural Alabama, the kind of place where steady work often meant factories, farms, or plants tied to the massive poultry industry that dominates the state. Alabama is one of the largest chicken producing states in the country, and the Tyson Keystone plant in Baker Hill was one of the main employers in the region. For many people, it wasn't a dream job, but it was a paycheck, and for men like Carlos, that mattered. At his age, this wasn't a first job or a teenage tryout at a factory life. It was the kind of work you would take because you know it pays the bills. Plants like Keystone didn't just hire young labor. They leaned on experienced men and women who could be counted on to show up day after day and endure the grind. The hours were long and the conditions were harsh, but it was steady, and in a place like Baker Hill, steady was everything. Carlos would have walked through the same heavy doors each shift, pulling on the protective gear the plant required. Rubber boots for the slick floors, gloves for the wet machinery, a hard hat, and maybe a smock or apron. For someone not used to it, the inside of the plant could be overwhelming. Bright lights glared overhead, conveyor belts stretched across the rooms, the constant hiss of water and cleaning sprays echoed against the metal walls. The air smelled faintly of bleach, raw chicken, and damp concrete. But for Carlos, this was familiar. It was the rhythm of his job. On August 31st, 2020, Carlos Len reported for his shift, just like he had done countless times before. His task that day was cleaning around the conveyor system. That might sound simple, but inside a poultry processing plant, it was one of the most dangerous parts of the work. The conveyors were long, motor-driven boats that carried chicken from one section of the plant to the other. They ran on rollers and gears, constant and strong. Workers like Carlos had to keep them free of debris and buildup, which meant leaning in close, spraying water, scrubbing, or reaching into tight spaces. The plant was loud and wet that day, just like always. The floor was slick underfoot, with the boats rattling with each steady grind. Carlos moved along the line with his hose, focused on keeping the machinery clean. He knew the danger, but this was part of the job. In plants like Keystone, you didn't stop the conveyors unless something went terribly wrong. And then, suddenly, it did. While Carlos was cleaning, part of him got too close to the moving machinery. Whether it was clothing, a glove, or just the force of the rollers catching, the conveyor seized hold of him, and in an instant, he was pulled forward. Machines like that don't hesitate. They keep turning, dragging in whatever they catch. And Carlos's body was drawn into the boat's relentless pull. Nearby co-workers saw it happen. His body pressed into the rollers as the machine ground on. Metal and rubber was crushing him as shouts erupted across the room. People screamed his name, scrambled toward the emergency shutoff, hands fumbling against slick steel as they tried to free him. But the conveyor kept running, its mechanical hum unchanged, indifferent to the human life caught in its grip. To really picture it, the scene was horrific. Blood spilled onto the wet floor, mixing with water in a thin red sheen. Workers pulled at him, some slipping as they tried to stop the conveyor, but it was too late. By the time the machine stopped, the damage was already catastrophic. Carlos had been crushed where he stood, his body mangled by the very equipment he had been assigned to clean. When emergency responders finally arrived, the plant was in chaos. The machine had just been running so steadily, now sat silent. Its frame smeared with what remained of the struggle. But Carlos was still there, lifeless, with his co-workers in shock, many of them unable to even look at the conveyor. The responders worked quickly to recover him, but there was nothing left to save. For the men and women who had been working beside him, the memory would not fade. They had seen him caught, heard the sickening sound of flesh and bone against machinery, and felt the helplessness of pulling with all their strength and realizing it wasn't enough. A factory floor that always felt routine was now scarred with a new reality, how fast life can be taken in a place like this. After his death, the OSHA opened an investigation to determine how such a fatal accident could happen inside one of the country's largest poultry processors. What inspectors found was clear. Like with most incidents, the tragedy wasn't an unpredictable mishap. It was preventable. They determined that Tyson had failed to protect workers from hazardous energy on the conveyor system Carlos had been assigned to clean. Federal law requires what's called a lockout/tagout procedure. Machinery must be powered down, locked, and tagged so it cannot start or continue moving while a worker is cleaning or repairing it. At the Keystone plant, obviously, that procedure wasn't being followed. Instead, employees like Carlos were sent to clean the equipment while it was still energized and moving, exposing them to exactly the kind of entanglement hazard that killed him. The agency cited Tyson for multiple serious violations, including not developing or enforcing a proper lockout/tagout program, and allowing unsafe cleaning practices. In total, OSHA issued fines of more than $160,000 connected to Carlos's death and related hazards at the plant. In addition to the fines, OSHA placed Tyson under pressure to change its practices. The company was required to correct that violations, retrain workers, and adopt safer procedures going forward. The findings also fed into a broader pattern. Tyson had actually been already cited at other facilities for similar failures, meaning OSHA viewed the Baker Hill case as part of a repeated problem, not a one-time oversight. When the plant reopened, the conveyor was cleaned, the floor scrubbed, and production resumed. Boxes of chicken continued to move down the lines, just as they did before. But for those who had knew Carlos, or even just stood near him that day, the images stayed. The man who walked in for his shift that morning never walked out again.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.